Joining us now is Austin Democratic Congressman Greg Casar. Congressman Casar, thank you so much for joining us. Although you represent a little bit more than Austin, right? Don't you have some of San Antonio too?
I've got a big chunk of San Antonio and a lot of the land in between.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. We want to talk a lot about the politics of immigration on Capitol Hill, but wanted to start with this incredible faceplant by House Republicans yesterday with their attempt to impeach Alejandro Mayorkas, a DHS secretary. So, were you on the floor? What the heck has so they wheeled in?
We got into this story.
Yeah. What happened? How did you guys kind of I guess outsmart, or maybe smart is not the word to use when referring to the House of Representatives. What on earth happened?
Well, the starting point of all of this is that Marjorie Taylor Greene demanded an impeachment of DHS Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. And in this impeachment, impeachment requires high crimes and misdemeanors. And in this case, they weren't even pretending there was a high crime. They weren't even trying to allege any kind of misdemeanor. They just said they didn't like the guy, that they disagree with people on immigration, and they wanted to impeach someone. And unfortunately, in this case, the vast, almost all the Republicans went along with it. But because a small handful of Republicans were willing to vote no, and then because the Republican majority has thinned out so much with things like the expulsion of George Santos, in some ways because of George Santos's antics and because Representative Al Green came directly from the hospital in scrubs to cast his vote, it turned out to be a tie vote, and Mr. Mayorkas was not impeached by the House yesterday. He never should have been impeached, but it's the perfect example of how in the Congress right now, there's not an actual debate on issues of immigration. There is just this political theater being led by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
And it sounds actually like Democrats did genuinely outsmart Republicans last night, because Republicans seem to have taken at face value that Al Green would not have been voting, that he was having this emergency surgery. Republicans claim Democrats told them Al Green would not be voting, and he voted anyway. Do you have any more insight on, did you think he was going to vote?
I guess if you call outsmarting just showing up, everybody showing up to work and everybody showing up to vote, and then Mr. Green, who is an OG from Texas, he's one of the hardest working men in Texas politics. He felt compelled to come and show up. I don't think that there was
it an intentional fake out? Okay, that was my question.
Yeah. We don't show up in the morning and hand Mike Johnson and Steve Scalise a list of people we have showing up that day. We just say as many of us that can show up are going to show up. And I think that for some reason they thought that there might be Democratic defections, or that they would be able to hold their entire party together. But thankfully, it's kind of weird to say thankfully a tiny number of Republicans were willing to not do a crazy thing yesterday. Again, there's many issues in which we can disagree. People can vote yes or vote no. But in the case of the impeachment of Mr. Mayorkas, there was no evidence. This was just straight up saying we're going to impeach someone because we feel like it. And that's just degrading an already degraded institution to a new level.
Well, and let me jump in on that question, because this might be an area where there's basic disagreement between myself and you and Ryan. Some Republicans, I agree on the impeachment articles. I read them again last night. I don't really think that they made the strongest possible case here. And I don't know that there was an actual clear-cut impeachment case to be made. The allegation that Mayorkas sort of violated his oath of office by, A, saying the border was secure and that he lied to Congress. That was part of the impeachment articles over the definition of what it means to have a secure border, and was getting a little ticky-tacky on that. But the allegation that he's violated his oath of office by allowing so many people, not to be detained, to make these asylum claims without being detained, which of course happened under Trump, it happened under Obama, it happened under George W. Bush. But the volume has intensified dramatically, and as has humanitarian patrol. So if you say the basic duty of the person who's in charge of Homeland Security is to secure a border, and you have the just intense magnification of a crisis on his watch, is there a case that constitutes a violation of his oath of office? Will you at least agree that it's some incompetence involved, or are his hands kind of tied by Congress's inability to pass laws on this?
When our asylum laws, as we have them, were passed, it was in many ways in response to our failures during the World War II era, where we turned people away from our shores and sent them back to the Holocaust to be killed. And in so many ways, we wrote these laws saying that was a horrific mistake. And so our laws are written to be able to make sure that we accept people and hear their asylum claims when they are fleeing desperation, persecution, and potential death. We don't want to send people back to that. And so it just so happens that Alejandro Mayorkas is DHS secretary, and Trump and Biden have been president during one of the biggest displacement crises in the modern history of the Western Hemisphere.
But aren't those two things related?
Numbers of people fleeing Venezuela. They're related, but not in the way that's usually talked about on Capitol Hill. These sanctions, for example, that we continue to impose on countries like Venezuela, the blockade on Cuba, what we do to these countries where they already have, of course, repressive governments and their own economic challenges. In many ways, we're pushing people out of these countries and then complaining about it when folks show up. And so folks aren't talking enough on Capitol Hill about how we can actually address where the root of the crisis is, which is in the Western Hemisphere and in Latin America. What we're starting to see is really just the result of it on our border. Of course, we need a more orderly, safe, and humane process for integrating people and processing people's claims and cases. But I believe it's actually not just to our moral benefit to do it well, but I think it's ultimately to our economic, cultural, and our national interest for us to accept immigrants, because in a place like Texas, in cities like Austin and San Antonio that everybody wants to move to, these are deeply immigrant and diverse cities. It's actually one of the greatest things about our state. And it's really, to me, a shame to see people like the governor trying to push such anti-immigrant rhetoric when really one of the greatest things about Texas is the way that we've accepted immigrants and been an immigrant state for so long.
So Democrats have really been taking a victory lap the last couple of days. You saw, seen people say, "Look, we gave everything we gave Republicans everything that they asked for, and they still said no to this." And they feel like they've won kind of like a short-term victory. But from my perspective, it seems like a long-term setback in the sense that now Democrats seem like they're kind of locked in on a pretty draconian policy path. I'm curious what you think of the deal that was struck in the Senate, which has since fallen apart. But like, pretend for a moment that it did pass the Senate and came to the House for a vote. How would you have responded?
It's a terrible deal, and because ultimately the provisions as it relates to asylum and the border actually don't fix the problems that we hear about in the community. If you're talking about how we can process people's cases more quickly, then we should actually have judicial review. And the Senate deal, in many ways, guts judicial review. If your issue or challenge is how can we deal with the fact that people that are immigrating here and are trying to escape violence oftentimes have to go to the underground market in order to be able to come here, have to wind up in the hands of cartels. Well, the best way to deal with that is to open up more legal pathways for migration, not closing legal pathways, which then pushes people into the hands of cartels. So this so-called Senate deal was closing those very pathways and ultimately would be something that would empower the cartels. It would create more chaos on the border. So if we want an actually more orderly and safe system, then we should be opening up more legal pathways. And that's traditionally been Democrats' position. And it was really unfortunate to see Democrats start to accept some of these Trump-era policies, ultimately in exchange for the Ukraine funding. I mean, that's really, you saw the statements on TV, but the statements in the back room, the real conversations were Republicans were willing to allow a vote on Ukraine funding if Democrats would accept some number of Trump-era immigration policies. And I hate to see us trumpet those as a win, but ultimately that's what the negotiation was all about.
Although Republicans argue that, and I think that there's some good evidence that under Mayorkas, there was a turn from Trump-era policies, like, for example, the way that MPP, Remain in Mexico, was executed after courts said that the Biden administration had to. They dramatically cut down how many people were enrolled in the program just like a huge, dramatic drop in how many people were enrolled. And that was an opening up, basically, of legal pathways via CBP1. And what we've seen as those legal pathways were opened up is is more and more people coming across the border. And that's one of the difficulties. 60 Minutes just did an incredible segment on Sunday night of Chinese nationals to the tune of, one rancher said, 3,000 people a week going through one hole in the border fence down by Tijuana. How do you increase legal pathways without also actually increasing cartels' ability to prey on a lot of people's economic aspirations? They don't all have, in fact, many of them have talked to them, don't have these credible fear asylum claims. So how do you open up those legal pathways without also enriching cartels, without also enticing people to take these treacherous journeys to the Darien Gap, up to our border, through Central America, Mexico? It's very hard to see how we do that without also, because the evidence in the last couple of years suggests, as we do that, we just increase the suffering and we enrich cartels.
The suffering currently exists in Latin America when a mom decides to grab her kid, go through the Darien Gap, risk rape, assault, famine, get on top of a train that they call La Bestia and ride up on top of that train through Mexico. That is because people are fleeing desperation, persecution, and worse. And the best thing that we can do is make sure that there is actually a pathway for applying to come here so that they aren't having to go, as you said, through a hole in the border fence or up a ladder or to break their leg coming down on the other side of the fence to make their claim. And so if we actually have those legal pathways for pursuing that, then people can apply. There are successful programs actually where people can get on a flight and apply and have their asylum case heard. Or frankly, we need more work visas and more family-based visas. We need more green cards. We need all of those opportunities for people to actually come here, because what you hear overwhelmingly from people in a place like Texas isn't that we want fewer people in the United States, is that what we actually want is for people to be able to migrate here legally. Mm-hmm. And we want people to be able to get in line and come legally. But when the line is decades long, then it's not really a line, it's just a closed door.
Yeah.
And the work visas point is an interesting one, because you often hear people say, well, a lot of these are kind of economic migrants. But sometime in the 1990s or so, we really shut down the ability of seasonal migrant workers to come, to say, like, they're going from El Salvador and they're working in the United States for a season and then they're coming back to El Salvador. That was kind of standard for a very long time. But then we shut down the border to the extent that it was too difficult. You had to pay cartels to get you back and forth. So it no longer made sense to kind of go back and forth for seasonal work. So instead of kind of nobody coming, instead a lot of people brought their families up. So is there a sense in Congress that there is some pathway toward kind of work visas for people who actually want to remain in their home country, but because of kind of economic situations want to come work in the United States for a while? And let me ask that question in the broader context of kind of what is the progressive vision for immigration? When it comes to climate, we know it's the Green New Deal. When it's healthcare, it's Medicare for all. When it comes to workers, we know it's increased union power. What is the progressive vision when it comes to immigration?
So yeah, I'll take both parts of your question. First off, where are we right now? And I think with what you just saw with the Mayorkas impeachment, with Governor Abbott having all these governors around him as they defy U.S. Supreme Court orders, in many ways we are so far behind in having the actual conversation on how we modernize our immigration system. People that have been here in Congress for decades say they haven't seen us be this far behind in so long, because 10 years ago we had a real agreement between Republicans and Democrats on comprehensive immigration reform that would have legalized millions of people. We wanted to get people a pathway to citizenship. We wanted to expand the ability, for example, for farm workers to come back and forth, and then for some people to be reunited with their families here in this country. And we haven't even gotten back to that yet. And so to your second question, Ryan, there is not the flagship all progressive immigration bill here in the Congress. There are things that we fight for, many of which are agreed to by the vast majority of the American people, like the Dream and Promise Act, to give dreamers legal status in this country. And we have bills like the registry bill that would just change a date in immigration law that would then therefore ultimately give legal status to millions and millions of people in this country. But I do think we need a broader progressive vision that actually recognizes that the working class is not just in the United States, but is across the hemisphere, and one that lifts up those working class people across the United States and Latin America. One that says we don't want to push people out of their home countries. You should have a right to be able to stay in your home country if that's where you want to stay. Should have a right to come across a border and work and lift up your economic situation and the economy of both countries. There should be strong labor standards ultimately, because we don't want competition across borders to be driving down wages. We actually want to be lifting people up. But all of that ultimately requires that we stop calling some folks so much lesser than other people. And the place that we're at right now, where you have over 13 million people who aren't given legal status, but many of whom have been living and working in the United States longer than I've been alive, is ultimately untenable. And I think the Democratic Party has to tackle that head on.
So speaking of that, actually, one of the things that was great for Kevin McCarthy was being in the minority. It papered over a lot of those divisions that ultimately did him in just in the last 6 months. So I wanted to ask how the relationship between progressive like yourself, where does everybody stand with Hakeem Jeffries on the Democratic side right now? Because Mike Johnson just had just an incredible face plant, actually 2 of them in a row yesterday, just last night. But on the Democratic side, how do you feel that Hakeem Jeffries is handling and sort of walking the tightrope of navigating all of the different sort of factions and relationships within your caucus?
So far, Leader Jeffries has made really concerted efforts to include progressive voices at the table. And as you pointed out, of course, in the minority position, in some ways that's easier. We can all unite around getting rid of grifter Kevin McCarthy, right? But I think that what is going to be really important in a majority, which I expect and hope that we'll have in a year, is for us to be able to actually not think about progressives as a proportion of no within the Democratic Party, but actually what is providing the vision and the impetus for us to do something with our majority. I think having a real vision from progressives will actually hopefully not just propel us to win a majority, but then really do something with it.
Congressman Casar, voters in Pakistan are going to the polls later tonight, Pakistan time. And I'm curious if you've been following this closely, and if so, whether you've communicated anything about the state of the elections and democracy to the State Department.
We have. It is really worrisome what is happening in Pakistan right now. And also, the United States' position on this needs to be so much more clear. We need to have free and fair elections in Pakistan, especially since it's an allied nation, especially since it's a nation where we send military aid, and especially if we want to have standing as the United States saying that we care about democracy. We can't be taken seriously in the world. The White House, the Biden administration can't be taken seriously. The United States can't be taken seriously if we say we are for democracy, but only if your country elects people that align with U.S. military interests or U.S. corporate interests. We have to be for democracy either way. And so we can't go and just condemn, for example, authoritarian practices and democratic backsliding in Bangladesh or Venezuela, but then turn a blind eye to what's happening in Pakistan, where we've had journalists incarcerated, violence against protesters, and then the very popular party of Imran Khan. Again, it is not to me to prefer one candidate over another, but if an entire candidate's party is essentially being shadow banned from the elections, that's a real problem, and the State Department should be saying something about it.
And some in Pakistan have called for the State Department to do kind of some of take some of the basic action that they've taken with other countries, say cancel some high-ranking visas, say confiscate some Manhattan expensive properties that some of the folks involved in cracking down on dissent and democracy in Pakistan might have. What kind of consequences do you think there could be for Pakistani military elite if they continue down the path of eroding democracy?
I recently met with the ambassador from Pakistan here to the United States and made it very clear that there already is existing law called the Leahy Law, and I know that you all have covered this extensively, that says that we can't be sending military assistance to a country where then that military assistance might be used to oppress its own people. So at a minimum, I'm calling for that military assistance to be withheld until there is actual free and fair elections, and we see an end to this kind of oppressive behavior by the military government.
Well, Congressman Casar, thank you so much for joining us on Counterpoints. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all so much.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.